Hey guys, tonight we will step into a living nightmare. The stench of King Henry VIII's rotting corpse rising so pungently through the grand hall that seasoned courtiers vomited right before the throne, while a pack of stray dogs rushed in to lick every drop of fluid leaking from his decaying coffin. Imagine the rotting flesh peeling away, bones exposed in the darkness, and soft moans echoing in the silent space. Honestly, you won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And don't forget to let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. The stench of King Henry VIII's corpse rose so pungently throughout the great hall that seasoned courtiers vomited at the foot of the throne, while a pack of stray dogs rushed in to lick every drop of fluid seeping from his rotting coffin. This scene was not merely a horrifying spectacle, but the beginning of a chain of medical tragedies that the Tudor court had struggled to conceal for centuries. Yet before anyone could reel from that rancid odour, we must understand more about the most powerful man in Europe at the time. A king once celebrated as a polymath prince, but who also left behind innumerable scandals and crimes in the annals of history. From his youth, Henry VIII displayed rare talents. He mastered 4 languages: English, Latin, French, and Italian, earning the respect of European envoys. He was a scholar, passionate about philosophy, regularly hosting academic debates with leading intellectuals, where he eagerly dissected the works of Erasmus and Sir Thomas More. His intellectual acuity extended beyond scholarship. He was also a gifted musician who composed sacred music and courtly songs, often performing on the virginal before his courtiers. Henry's music and poetry softened the image of a formidable monarch, yet they also revealed his desire to leave a cultural legacy that transcended England's shores. In addition to his linguistic and literary gifts, Henry VIII was regarded as an exceptional athlete. He was devoted to archery, fencing, and especially jousting, the sport of valiant horsemen. Under his reign, the royal lists became a magnet for the nobility, where Henry displayed both his military prowess and chivalric spirit. His sharp leadership skills were further honed on the hunt. When directing a deer hunt, he issued decisive commands that reinforced his reputation as the hunting king of unflinching courage and command. Diplomatically and politically, Henry VIII was equally formidable. He built a powerful navy, laying the foundation for England's later maritime supremacy. His break with the Roman Catholic Church and the establishment of the Church of England was not merely a religious act, but a strategic political maneuver that allowed the crown to seize the vast wealth of the monasteries and strengthen centralized authority. This bold vision elevated England's status on the European stage, transforming a once modest kingdom into a power to be reckoned with. Yet a ruler of such greatness also carried a dark side. Henry VIII was notorious for his irascible temper, capable of shifting from mild-mannered to fury in an instant. When enraged, he would not hesitate to order the beheading of anyone in his court deemed responsible for unwelcome news. The execution of his former friend Sir Thomas More, who refused to accept the schism with Rome, demonstrated that Henry would sacrifice even the closest bonds to safeguard his absolute power. In matters of marriage and family, Henry's legacy is equally infamous. He wed 6 times, and 3 of those marriages ended with his wives either beheaded or imprisoned under harsh sentences. Women who had once enjoyed his favour. His insistence that the nobility support his divorce from Catherine of Aragon in order to marry Anne Boleyn sent shockwaves through the kingdom, sparking public discontent and consolidating royal authority without papal consent. Henry also brutally suppressed the nobility. He established the notorious Court of Star Chamber to deal with dissenters, a secretive tribunal infamous for its use of torture. Concentrating unlimited power in one individual made the court oppressive and fearsome. Many noble families lost their lands, titles, and even their lives on the basis of flimsy accusations. His extravagance was equally legendary. He spent enormous sums of royal treasure on lavish banquets, grandiose tours, and gilded wardrobes. Under his rule, Hampton Court Palace was expanded with ornate gardens, a bowling green, and a grand orchestra to satisfy his every whim. Yet behind this glittering display lay a heavy burden of taxation on the populace, many of whom lived in abject poverty to support his opulence. In his later years, Henry became increasingly paranoid. He distrusted everyone around him, convinced that his servants plotted to poison him and steal the crown. Castle walls were reinforced, doors sealed, and guards multiplied. But his fear never abated. Absolute power brought an awful loneliness, costing him genuine relationships and plunging him ever deeper into the darkness of his own rule. Thus, behind that rotting, fetid corpse lay a man both magnificent and terrifying. His talents and vision made Henry VIII one of Europe's most remarkable monarchs. Yet it was his lust for power and ruthless cruelty that drove him to the most horrific brink of body and mind. And after only a few moments confronting his decaying coffin, one finally grasps the tragic intersection of glory and atrocity in his reign, as the dawn snow on the Greenwich tiltyard still clung to the ground in delicate layers, and the cold wind whispered resentful laments. Henry VIII fell to the earth under his more than 300-pound frame clad in heavy, gilded armour. At that moment, his imposing figure had seemed invincible, yet a single misstep turned all his majesty into the deafening clash of metal and a body collapsing freely. The ice, as hard as shattered glass, did not tremble beneath the pounding hooves, and the morning sunlight that had sparkled on his armour now reflected panic. For a brief instant, the world froze. Only the fallen man's laboured breathing broke the oppressive silence. 2 hours passed in absolute stillness, as though in an interminable dream. In that darkness of unconsciousness, Henry heard no cries, only his own heartbeat echoing in his chest. Strong at first, then gradually weakening. Each breath was burdensome, as though his battered body refused to acknowledge the soul within. Every cell shivered with cold, every vein constricted and relaxed, composing a wordless cacophony that heralded a brutal transformation. In that moment, Henry was not a powerful king, but a fragile creature buried in the white expanse of the frozen tiltyard. As the last vestiges of that stupor filtered through his eyelids, Henry awoke in shock to find himself crushed beneath the weight of his heavy armour. His mind spun like a waterfall slamming into rock, each heartbeat threatening to shatter his ribs. He struggled amid a paralyzing, searing pain, as if thousands of needles pierced his flesh. Cold air seeped through gaps in his armour, igniting shards of memory from his earlier moments of glory, only to crush them beneath the inescapable ice of the tiltyard. In his first moment of awareness, Henry no longer recognized himself. When he opened his eyes, chaos sprawled before him. The pale faces of court officials, their terrified gazes fixed on him, brows furrowed with fear. The first sound he heard was his own laboured, bitter gasp, mingled with the faint groan of a fallen man. But instead of gratitude for survival, Henry felt an electric surge of rage coil through every cell. His fingers clenched into fists unconsciously, teeth ground together, and his heart erupted in unprecedented fury. That fury was not merely a defensive reflex, but a declaration of war on himself. Henry realized he had lost control. The very thing he regarded as supreme power. Panic crept into every breath. The terror of being overpowered. The fury of betrayal by his own body. The winter wind lashed at his armour as if to purge his wrath into ashes. Yet instead, it fanned the flames of his resentment. He felt his stomach clench, his throat tighten, longing to shout, but only a silent growl escaped. In the dim haze, Henry saw his reflection in the armour, an alien figure with wild eyes. He realized that from the moment he fell, the polished prince he had been was shattered. In its place stood a spectre carved by wound and hollowed by physical agony and spiritual destruction. Memories of calm debates, virginal melodies ringing in silence. And his proud displays on the lists were now fleeting illusions, slipping from his grasp. Henry dragged himself upright. Every joint protested with a creak, as though fragments of his soul had crumbled away in an instant. All his ambitions that had propelled him to glory, all the decisions that had reshaped a kingdom, now clung only as a stubborn will to survive. Exhausted, Henry still tensed every muscle, determined to prove he would not yield to fate. Yet as his gaze swept across the cold stone walls, he realized this place offered no refuge for a prince bound by ideals. It had become the domain of a lone combatant trapped in merciless snow, awaiting the next storm of death. Each melting drop of snow clung to his still damp armor, mingling with the rank stench seeping through its cracks. Henry felt his heart skip a beat, then pound harder than ever. He envisioned every shard of ice as a dagger, slicing deep into his numbed flesh. The physical pain became a minor key dirge, harmonizing with the wind's howl, the horse's neigh, and distant cries an apocalyptic symphony. The unnatural silence of those 2 hours was finally broken by a faint groan. Henry felt it rise from within as the last bead of sweat trickled down his brow. He lifted his head to the grey sky, where black clouds churned like gathering demons. In that moment, his consciousness no longer clung to power, but to the simple desire to survive. Yet that very desire bound him to delirious visions, each pang of pain threatening to tear his soul apart. Henry squeezed his eyes shut. Letting his mind drift into the void, he felt an icy tear roll down not from agony, but from realizing he had lost on the very field of honor. A final gust of wind blew away the rotten snowflakes, as if erasing the scars of catastrophe. Yet deep wounds do not heal easily, nor can his fractured soul ever return to its original form. When Henry rose for the last time, he looked like a king reborn from a nightmare. His steps trembled, yet defied challenge. His eyes darkened, yet burned with unyielding resolve. Greenwich Palace, with its cold stone walls and lonely flagpoles, witnessed his return to the world of the living not with the heart of the once proud monarch, but with the soul of a hardened tyrant who had survived a cataclysm of the mind. And from that moment on, England officially witnessed the transformation from the accomplished prince into an autocrat, as a shadowy light began to spread through the Tudor court. After the horrific fall on the tilt-yard, Henry VIII awoke in a cramped world of fear and inner chaos, where all memories of poetry, music, and learned debates dissolved like mist. His eyes, once bright with intellectual passion, were now clouded and flickering with delusion. Deep within his mind, a dictator wandered in darkness. No trace of the gallant prince who once revelled in words and melody. His brain, like a grand castle struck by lightning, had been shattered, giving birth to a new being violent, frenzied, and rife with suspicion. That fateful afternoon at Greenwich played back in slow motion through the layers of Henry's consciousness. Before the accident, every word he spoke fell as gently as grain-laden stalks swaying in the breeze. Now, the memory of that calm voice was only a faint reflection in his disordered mind. Modern neurologists describe the severe frontal brain injury that erased the boundary between reason and instinct. The region of his cortex that once served as an iron gate controlling personality and restraining impulses had been blasted open, flooding him with raw emotion and transforming him into a killer. Within the palace, Henry had previously been a monarch who rarely sentenced nobles to death without careful consideration. His mercy sometimes even raised questions about the strength of his rule. He had maintained nearly 30 years of marriage to Catherine of Aragon, proving that some part of his heart still held affection, even if he ultimately rejected that love. Yet after the fall, only 4 months later, the cruel axe fell on Anne Boleyn's neck. The night before her execution, she was told she would be granted mercy. But at dawn the guillotine's moan rang out, and Henry stood there, bewildered, as though watching a play rather than witnessing the death of the woman he had once adored. And it did not end there. Thomas Cromwell, his most loyal advisor, also found himself on the execution roll, the very man who had guided Henry through political labyrinths. The only one to whom Henry had poured out his confidences was condemned for treason. When word spread that Cromwell would be beheaded, Henry felt his heart go dry. His thirst for blood and confusion flaring in equal measure, he imagined even the most faithful hands could turn into blades at his back, and the palace itself became a dark maze with no escape. On mornings at Hampton Court, before dawn's light could filter through the heavy, dark window panes, Henry would wake up in a choky sob, tears streaming for no clear reason. The sobbing came like a glass wall shattering inside his soul, crying out in exhaustion amid the stillness of the court. The king's tears rent the space, causing his trembling attendants to retreat silently into the shadows of the corridors. No one knew how to comfort him, for Henry had never before let a tear fall in public. Amid magnificent ceremonies and countless audiences, Henry could suddenly halt mid-blessing, clench the edge of a table as if about to snap it in two, and mumble words no one could understand. One moment his laughter boomed like thunder. The next it morphed into a roar demanding blood. "I want to see blood!" The palace shook in chaos. Courtiers stood as if crossing a rickety bridge over nothingness. For Henry was not merely angry, he was asserting his absolute right over life and death, after having once believed in the notion of a benevolent sovereign. Darkness in his mind stretched like an endless corridor. Whenever he glanced through a crack in the door, Henry saw his reflection in two dead blue eyes, probing anyone who passed. He imagined enemies lurking, waiting to steal his crown. The knock at the palace door, the click of leather sandals, all sounds became threats. Whenever the door creaked open, he was ready to press the bell for his guards. Paranoia had dyed every thought red. Hampton's Gardens, once alive with birdsong and blazing roses, now appeared to Henry as a silent nightscape where cold winds carried the shape of invisible foes. He trudged heavily along the pebble paths, each stone pressing into his ankles like needles, recalling wounds that would never heal. Every dewdrop clinging to leaves seemed to mirror his panic, silvered images tracing the wrinkles on his brow. Even music, what he once called medicine for the soul, could no longer soothe him. The hymns that echoed through the royal chapel became the final notes of despair. Their clear tones betrayed a shattering pain, forcing him to clutch his chest as his heart pounded erratically. Occasionally, Henry imagined whispers drifting from the past, fragments of memory echoing from the tombs of Anne, of Cromwell, of all the spirits he had spurned. On moonless nights, Henry sat silently by a tall window, staring out at a sky tinted with charcoal. The night wind whistled through stone cracks, mocking, "You are no longer you." He felt he had lost both flesh and soul, drowning in a sea of doubt and hatred, his heart clenched with accumulated guilt. Yet, despite everything, he could not relinquish his lust for power. Those silent sobs in the night were the last gasps of his old self, agonizingly calling for help, but drowned out by his bloodthirsty screams. Each bout of paranoia drove Henry to shout at the royal physicians, "Cure me at once! I want to live!" But the medicines were powerless against his brain injury and inner torture. He howled like an abandoned child. "Why must I endure this suffering?" leaving the doctors bowed in helpless silence, the hearts pounding as they struggled to find an answer. Henry's mind had become a new battlefield, where will and pain fought endlessly. He was no longer the philosophizing scholar, nor the elegant prince of musical dances. Instead, he was the master of his own psyche, wielding life and death power, even as he was tormented by invisible wounds, and in every surge of tears or roar demanding blood, Henry once again asserted his dominion, the greatest horror of power having to endure one's own self. After that brutal fall, Henry VIII not only lay incapacitated by his brain injury, but also began to endure a physical torment with no end in sight. The old wound on his calf, a remnant of a previous jousting mishap, was torn open entirely by the crushing weight of his armor and body. Each gash yawned like a volcanic crater, pus streaming endlessly to soak the bandages and velvet robes. In the flickering candlelight of the royal infirmary, the stench of necrotic flesh suffused the air, as though a dark spirit lurked within. That odour did more than assault the nostrils. It pierced the fortress of his mind, causing Henry to curl inward in despair. Secret medical records preserved in the royal archives described the ulcer as swollen, oozing, and so agony-ridden that even a gentle draught from the window would draw a groan from him. Whenever the yellow-brown discharge plopped onto the cold stone floor, Henry heard it as his body's mournful cry. The palace corridors stretched out infinitely, their stone walls sighing under each drip of pus. Murmuring rebukes. Why were you careless? Why have you brought this suffering upon yourself? The damp chill sank into his flesh like invisible hands squeezing his heart, driving his mind into panic. Without the concept of antibiotics, Tudor surgeons could only cleanse the wounds with salt water and spirits, then dress them in coarse linen. The infirmary log records, shelves lined with dozens of sodden dressings, their stench hanging heavy as the calm before a storm. Henry, lying on a bed as high as a coffin, listened to the slow footsteps of the physicians each time they came to change his dressings. To him, those footsteps sounded like a death knell, counting down each passing day. Night after night, as pale moonlight slanted through the window bars, Henry awoke trapped in an unending nightmare. He felt his trembling hand brush against the yellowed linen, heard a drop of pus hiss like a whisper, "Open, there is no escape." The pain struck his mind like a blow, sending him shuddering and drenched in sweat, as if racing death itself. His thoughts spiraled. When will this wound finally heal? Or will I lie here forever, cut off from the world? That unanswered question tormented every waking moment. Day after day, the fear of infection gripped his chest like a vice. Each time the physicians examined him, Henry held his breath, his pulse pounding as if he might flee. He imagined bacteria swarming the wound like invading armies, tearing at his flesh and sowing chaos within. Each ray of sunlight piercing the curtains felt like a needle driving into his skin, making him cry out in agony. He loathed the light for exposing his weakness, yet prayed for dawn to break, to signal another day of existence. In his delirium, Henry sometimes told himself that the wound mirrored his soul, rotting, bleeding, and convulsing. He could no longer distinguish where flesh ended and spirit began. Each tug of the dressing sent the once irregal monarch into panic, eyes wide like a spectre stumbling into a tomb. He clutched the blankets to resist the rasping linen, his throat choking, tears slipping down unbidden. He spent sleepless nights wondering if the infirmary had acted wisely. The heavy lead gutter, devised to compress the wound, a daring medical innovation, proved instead like chains binding the infection. Each cumbersome lead rivet pressed into his flesh like an unwitting boulder, cutting off circulation and driving necrosis deeper. Henry pictured the gutter as demonic armor, sucking the life from his leg and magnifying his pain whenever the wind stirred. Darkness in his mind echoed with the sound of pus striking the lead gutter. Like the drums of apocalypse, Henry could not escape the image of himself, hunched and pleading for a miracle, be it divine or arcane. But the Tudor court possessed no sorcerers, only crude remedies and despair lurking behind locked doors. The once splendid palace had become a prison where his wound's moan was his sole ally. Each morning, Henry sat on the edge of his high bed, his bandaged legs dangling, watching raindrops spatter against the wooden window. The constant drip sounded like an hourglass ticking away his life. Every drop was a moment of agony in his heart. At times, he sneered, "Let the rain fall forever, to drown out your cries." His laughter was icy, a glint of madness flashing in his eyes. For 11 long years, Henry witnessed his body's destruction moment by moment. The 10-ish bulger-sized ulcer swelled into a deep crater on his calf, rupturing with every step, leaving a sting as if needles tore at him from within. He shuffled through corridors, draped in mourning cloth, its mottled purple seeming to absorb all light. Those funeral hangings pressed upon his pain, imposing a chill as if stained with his own blood. In Henry's soul, the wound was no mere injury. It was death's tolling bell. Each drip of pus onto the cold stone was a mournful note, reminding him how much of his gentle humanity he had lost. He screamed in silence, "Why won't you let me rest?" But the palace answered only with thick silence, as if submerged in the viscous reek of his own rot. Sometimes Henry gazed at his bandaged feet, seeing them as two rotten stumps bowing under their burden. He imagined each step a pilgrimage through personal hell, where pain and despair entwined. Whenever he tried to stand, he heard the flesh crack and ooze, as though each sinew of his soul splintered too. Yet Henry would not yield. In every spasm of agony, a spark of defiance flared. He forced himself onward, telling himself that power lay in endurance. "If I can survive this torment," he resolved, "I shall be invincible." His mind clung to will, like a cactus to barren rock, striving upward amid desolation. The ulcer, the pus, and the lead gutter had become unwilling allies in his inner war. They reminded him daily of the price of the crown and of power. With each surge of pain, Henry discovered a new, ruthless strength, a colder perspective on the world and its people. And in that ceaseless crucible of suffering, Henry VIII learned the most horrifying lesson of all. A king's measure is not his glory, but his capacity to confront pain to its bitter end, to conceal the unbearable stench of his grotesque ulcer. Henry VIII commanded the royal perfumers to import precious oils all the way from Arabia. Each drop of rose essence and ambergris was meticulously blended, like warm dawn light poured onto his skin. He immersed himself in the fragrant waters, believing for a moment that the dreadful odor would be erased. But as soon as the perfume seeped away, Henry realized that the scent was merely a fragile mask, offering only a temporary cover. Each bath became a tragic ritual, a silver tub intricately carved with dragons and phoenixes. A cold mountain breeze slipping through a narrow window, Henry closed his eyes, letting the warm water soothe his cracked flesh. Trying to imagine the ulcer did not exist. In his mind, the rose and ambergris danced like silk-robed dancers, a fleeting fantasy to carry him beyond the nightmare. Yet as the bath water drained, the rot stench rose again, with even greater force, as relentless as a vengeful spirit. He then ordered the royal painter to produce a new portrait, calves sculpted and slim like marble statues, with no trace of injury. Every brushstroke was meant to conceal the necrotic flesh, transforming his legs into symbols of invincibility in gold and silver hues. Yet on the canvas's delicate silk, Henry saw the reflection of the wound, an ingrained scar that could not be painted away. The portrait only reminded him that illusion could never overpower the harsh reality of agony. His heart bore a second invisible wound. Toxins from the rotting tissue had seeped into his bloodstream, infiltrating his vessels and spreading to his liver and brain. Modern experts call this chronic osteomyelitis, a bone infection that unleashes bacteria and inflammatory agents throughout the body. Henry felt each pulse of agony surge through his veins like a violent electrical current. The pain was more than a sensation. It was a scathing rebuke. Every tremor, every step became a merciless torment. In the infirmary's flickering candlelight, shadows quivered across his cracked skin, projected like phantoms onto the walls. In each dark silhouette, Henry imagined his ulcer erupting like a volcano, the cold wind cutting through window cracks like a blade. The relentless ache resembled the excruciating torment of a toothache magnified over every moment. He bit his lip to stifle a groan, Yet the pain composed a wordless requiem of despair. By day, Henry attempted to resist. He sat on a mock throne to receive envoys, stretching his legs outward to hide the bandages. Yet each time he rose, he heard his bones crackling, as though his body were about to collapse. Every pang was a storm in his chest, driving him to fight on, only to drag him back into despair. The agony did not cease with nightfall, but haunted his dreams, waking him in cold sweats. The fever struck suddenly, like a nocturnal thief. Henry's skin blazed with heat, then abruptly seized him in freezing tremors. The violent swings in body temperature threw his heart into chaos. Chills racing down his spine. Sweat poured, then sealed into ice, leaving him unable to distinguish heat from cold. In his mind, temperature became a weapon, torturing both body and spirit, severing will from his fragile flesh. Nausea and ravenous hunger entwined into a vicious loop. He stared at distant plates of food like drops of honey, yet his mouth bristled with bitterness. Henry wondered, "Why must I eat? I no longer deserve it." But when hunger struck, he swallowed bread hastily, only to retch it back, guilt gnawing at him. Hunger and sickness became ruthless allies, driving him deeper into a spiritual crucible. On rainy days, each drop striking the bathtub echoed his wound's hiss, reminding him of pus seeping from the ulcer. The window pane soaked with dew resembled sorrowful eyes, gazing upon him with hopeless pity. The endless rain seemed to strive to wash away his suffering, but only left the ulcer more disintegrated. Henry looked up as if begging for the storm to cease, then bowed his head in despair. On moonless nights, pale silver light filtered into the room, resting gently on the bandages. Henry lay between shafts of moonlight and shadow, his breathing rapid as though swimming in a sea of flames. He imagined crimson bacteria swirling around the wound like torches, stirring the fires of fever. Life and death wrestled within him in that eternally prolonged instant. His psyche swung between a longing for peace and utter terror. He dreamed of a miraculous cure, some magic to banish the pain. Sometimes, Henry whispered to himself, "Perhaps I should surrender." But the indomitable will in his bones would not allow it. Whenever the agony peaked, he discovered in it a terrifying strength, a conviction that if he could endure it, nothing could ever defeat him. A decade of unending torment had forged Henry VIII into the very image of endurance. Not glory, not conquests, but the capacity to withstand unrelenting suffering became his measure in every drop of pus, every feverish shiver, every bead of sweat, and every desperate bid for survival. Henry learned the most terrible lesson. True power lies in the ability to confront pain to its absolute limit. As the toxins from his rotting tissue seeped into his bloodstream and crept up to his brain, Henry VIII realized it was not his body alone that tormented him, but his own mind, the fiercest battleground of all. In sudden fits of rage, the palace would erupt in manic laughter, only to be followed by blood-curdling screams of fury. He might see a jester dancing before him, then point and order that very fool's head to be struck off mid-performance. No burst of fireworks could conceal the murderous thirst swelling within him. The faint beat of ceremonial drums transformed in his mind into funeral drums tolling his doom, igniting paranoid whispers, "They're plotting to assassinate me," he would mutter to himself as the sky beyond the window swirled grey. Every gilded mirror in the palace corridors became an accusing eye, scrutinizing his every move. Henry came to believe that even the most loyal servant could swap his meal for poison, compelling them to sip first in his presence as a life or death trial. Marriage, once a private affair, had become public spectacle and purging. By 1540, only 4 years after the Greenwich accident, his paranoia peaked. He saw Catherine Howard, his new bride of 17, as an arrow aimed at his throne. He interrogated her ceaselessly about adultery rumours, though he never sought proof. A cold wind billowed through the velvet drapes, carrying the musty scent of mourning cloth, whispering encouragement to his fears. She deceives you. She betrays you. Henry gripped his sword, waiting for a single signal to strike. And yet, in an instant, he could burst into euphoric laughter, his eyes shimmering with the intellect of the scholar he once was. That laughter, echoing through the night, sent chills down the spines of his guards. None knew when it might snap into the roar of a table-flipping command. "Bring me his head!" Darkness coiled round the corridors. Providing the stage for the Mad King's reckless drama, Henry watched lightning fork across the stormy sky. As relentless and agonizing as the ulcer on his leg, jolts of pain that never ceased. He took thunder as a divine warning, a prelude to imminent betrayal. Each thunderstorm outside seemed to fuse with his fury, amplifying his paranoia until he became a savage beast, poised to rend anyone who dared challenge his power. In rare moments of clarity, Henry saw the ruin of his intellect, memories of tranquil debates, the drama of love with Anne Boleyn, fragments of shattered happiness, all mired in confusion. He asked himself, am I still myself, or merely a spectre haunting these halls? Rage and dread tore at one another within him, driving his heart into a relentless frenzy. Like a perpetual storm, the neighing of horses in the courtyard, their hooves thudding through mud, recalled the tilt-yard at Greenwich where his calamity began. But instead of nostalgia, fear gripped him. Enemy steeds could charge at any moment. Henry would slam the heavy wooden doors shut, bolt them thrice over. Yet he no longer trusted any refuge. Each latch and bolt seemed to mock him. You cannot escape the chaos in your mind. The once-a splendid candlelit palace had become a lair for his inner demons. The precious fragrances that once masked his wounds now lay heavy as obstacles. Each drop of oil splashing onto the cold stone floor felt like imagined blood. Henry smelled the perfume as a lie. I am well. I do not suffer, but his physical and mental agony offered no truce, constricting him like a ring around the talented monarch's wrist. His fevers grew fiercer, blurring day into night. At times he believed he wandered between sleep and dawn, picturing Catherine Howard standing before him, her lips curled in a sly smile. Her imagined gaze made him tremble, envisioning beheading her. Then moments later, he'd forget and laugh maniacally. When presiding over court, Henry stood before his throne like a living wax figure, his gaze alternating between intense focus and wild bewilderment. He'd halt midgrant, bow his head to listen to the wind whistling through the vaulted beams, as if hearing the conspirators whisper. He'd turn abruptly toward the Queen, murmuring, I saw you exchange glances with that young man. No one dared deny it. For the king's rage could be a death sentence. That paranoia seeped into every tile of the floored corridors, every seam of the velvet drapes. Henry paced the silent ballroom, where the orchestra no longer played. Only his own heartbeat thudded through the gilded walls. The gold-leafed panelling seemed to weep drops of red in the hush of tick-tick, like a time bomb ready to explode. Even in the sanctuary of his private chambers, Henry heard false footsteps. A voice hissed through the window crack. Your Majesty, the people are talking. That alone sent him shooting up, sword in hand, rushing to the window to stare down at the courtyard, knuckles white on the wooden railing, as though an enemy might climb up and attack. In his mind, and footsteps and flattery merged into a chorus of hatred and paranoia. Faith offered him no respite. Henry once chanted prayers for peace, but now the words rang back like echoes off cold stone. Whoever hears them shall be cursed. He could not quell the turmoil within with devotion. He instead imagined swinging his sword to banish the ghosts. Day after day, Henry ceased to be a sovereign engaged in governance, and instead became a machine of wrath. Each decree issued could carry an order for execution. He knew his paranoia gnawed at his soul. Yet his thirst for power outweighed his fear. He told himself, either I destroy my enemies, or they destroy me. That resolve steadied him amid the inner hurricane, even as he feared that his madness would herald the tragedy to come. In every delirious moment, Henry whirled within his mantle of authority, slashing away any line between friend and foe. His eyes blazed with the conqueror's light, while his inner self plummeted into an abyss of disorientation, tormented in mind and ruthless in power. Henry VIII became history's most tragic royal figure, both victim of his own delusions and fascist exterminator. In that fleeting madness, he shattered every human value, leaving behind the image of a savage, isolated king wielding a sword amid a palace steeped in illusory blood. In 1542, a new nightmare shattered what little hope Henry VIII had left. The ulcer that seemed stable suddenly turned septic. The rotting flesh oozing pus that shifted from yellow to green and then brown-black. Dr. Vickers' chilling notes called it the smell of death. One night, an east wind howled through the wooden window frames, carrying icy droplets that stung his skin. Henry lay in his royal bed, the rancid stench filling the chamber, each breath feeling like a knife twisting in his heart. Every sudden sneeze felt like a deeper incision into his soul, making him crave another fragrance, some miracle to bury the suffering. Worst of all, he could not move. His leg throbbed so intensely that the slightest lift sent his blood racing and pain, stabbing like a red-hot needle. In that agony, Henry turned to food as a temporary relief. Sweet breads, salted meats, to rich cheeses, anything to chew. Yet every bite reminded him of his ulcer. Putrid pus coating his tongue, bitterness spreading until he swallowed tears. He ate not only out of hunger, but to distract himself from the relentless torment, hoping those fleeting moments of fullness would drown out the endless pain. Within months, his body was grotesquely transformed. His weight ballooned from 280 pound, 127 kilogram, to over 350 pound, 159 kilogram. Skin stretched taut over bulging fat. When Henry sat down, folds of flesh pooled around his waist like an encircling river. His once snug armor became a prison, and he stared at his reflection with growing dread, a massive lump of flesh, motionless and rusting beneath its gilded shell. In his mind, that image became a dungeon, iron collars, reminding him that power could itself become a manacle. More than a decade earlier, Henry had galloped triumphantly in the lists, spear raised in the tilt yard. Now he was captive to his own body. Hampton Court sight of lavish banquets bore the brunt of his decline. Floorboards cracked under his weight, beams creaked like a warning of collapse. The court hurried to reinforce the structure, adding crossbeams, shoring up joists, and widening doorways so his wheeled bed could pass through. Every stone pillar and velvet drape came to bear the imprint of their master's grotesque transformation. Even the great throne in the Hall of State had its armrests removed and retrofitted on hinges, so Henry could sit without his sides being scraped. Each time he lowered himself, the metallic click of hinges sounded like chains closing around him in ceremony. In his mind, he felt a silent shame. The very symbols of his authority had become instruments of his confinement. At dawn, Henry opened his eyes to weak sunlight filtering through the enlarged window. He peered down on the altered palace. The cobblestone approach widened for his rolling bed, walls reverberating with the footsteps of attendants carrying his bath pan and bedside tray. He felt like a deposed deity, his psyche recoiling. Once I bestowed blessings, now I accept care like an infirm child. Night after night. The flickering candles in the royal chambers contested with the darkness that tormented him. The ulcer pulsed with renewed intensity, forcing his pulse into a ragged rhythm. In his delirium, Henry heard the steady drip of pus onto the stone floor like a funeral drum. He imagined that flow spreading through the entire palace, eating away at every brick and wall, his soul's pain rippling without boundary. Eating non-stop brought no joy. Deep down, Henry confessed. Each bite felt like consuming his own chains. Rich morsels turned into a cruel drama. He'd swallow eagerly, then retch them up, racked by guilt for inflicting this self-torture. His mind wavered. Am I living, or merely prolonging my own agony? That unanswerable question felt like an eternal sentence. By day, Henry still rose to preside over the council. Though his painful leg and burden of flesh impeded him, he leaned on a specially crafted cane. Each step a torturous crawl, armor groaning in protest. Servants scurried aside in the hush of sorrowful ceremony, creating a mournful rhythm. And in every regal summons, Henry's eyes no longer shone with pride, but with the hollow dread of a prisoner. At night, after the Hall of State was sealed, Henry sat alone at his dressing table. Hints of rose and ambergris still lingered in the air, but did nothing to mask the pervasive rot. Oily streaks trailed down his throat as sweat mingled with viscous drops, coating his fingertips. Peering into the mirror, he saw his distorted form, swollen legs wrapped in stained bandages, the imprint of physical torture etched across his face. In that moment of stillness, the ulcer seemed to whisper, "I am still here," and his body replied, "I cannot depart." That union of pain and awareness forged a monstrous strength. Henry resolved to survive and prove that, despite being battered, he remained an unconquerable king. A rare smile would cross his lips, his eyes blazing with defiant pride. Beneath it all, each incision, each speck of pus, each feverish wave still gnawed at him, but his will to live flared like an unquenchable flame. Henry told himself, "With every day I endure, my power grows more unbreakable." Clinging to that thought, he accepted his grotesque form, making the crown not just a symbol, but a testament to his supreme endurance. And Hampton Court, once home to triumphant symphonies, now echoed the dolorous tolling of body and soul. In that shroud of darkness, Henry VIII rose a monument to perseverance, allowing the world to witness a harrowing journey no other monarch dared imagine. Age d'armes, the creaking of pulleys echoed throughout the royal chamber, heralding the start of an endless tragic ritual. 4 chamberlains, resplendent in ceremonial robes and faces as impassive as automatons, used the pulley system to lift Henry VIII from his velvet-draped bed. In that moment, the king's regal bearing vanished. He was nothing more than a massive body, oozing blood and pus, reliant on others' strength just to stand. His mind recoiled under the pressure, waves of shame and failure flooding through every fibre, his heart tightening like a vice in his chest. As his body swung unsteadily on the ropes, he was swiftly transferred to a concealed wheelchair hidden behind golden curtains. The chair glided across the cool stone floor, its wheels leaving wet tracks like invisible tears. Each turn was a vortex of fate, reminding Henry that his power was as fragile as that wooden wheel. The Tudor court bolted the iron doors shut, determined to keep any curious eyes from glimpsing the stark truth. They feared the raw reality might shatter the illusion of invincible authority. Outside the throne chamber, the public saw only a dignified king, offering gracious smiles and proclamations of benevolence. Lavish feasts and solemn audiences were meticulously staged like grand pageants. Piano and string ensembles played to mask Henry's laboured breathing behind the backstage curtain. Warm cups of tea, elegantly arranged pastries, and plush tapestries spread across the floor discreetly concealed the image of a monarch sinking deeper into a medical nightmare. But behind that velvet veil, Henry curled inward, tormented by nameless pain. Fevers visited like searing blades, scorching every calloused patch of flesh. He felt deep lines etch into his brow, chills coursing through him despite the heated rooms. Sweat slicked his hair and smudged the expertly applied makeup, leaving him looking like a distorted statue, his features smeared. Yet he forced a determined smile. The ulcer on his leg, once oozing yellow pus, had turned a dark brown black, tiny rivulets seeping down to his polished leather boots. In his mind, each drop was his body's lament, an elegiac note echoing through the silent hall. He closed his eyes and pictured those drips morphing into menacing phantoms whispering, "I will devour you," a persistent hatred that would not be driven off. In one rare moment when Henry was seated, he glanced at the chamberlains beside him. They moved with the precision of seasoned performers, every gesture exact. No emotion permitted to slip across their faces. Watching them, Henry wondered, "Does any one of you remember that I once launched sweeping reforms? Brought peace and prosperity?" The loneliness was stark. Even those closest to him saw only an object of power, not a man in agony. Each time Henry wiped the sweat from his brow, the cool velvet still could not erase the burn of his back. His mind spiraled back to days when he rode stallions in the hunt. The wind whispering past his ear, and the forest's scent a calming balm. Now he heard only the east wind shrieking through the curtains, reminding him that he could not escape the pain consuming his soul. The space around Henry seemed to shrink whenever the ulcer flared. The cold floor sucked warmth from his body, making him tremble. The four chamberlains, tense with effort, lowered him back onto his seat once more, as if each settling was a new act of torment. They placed a thin silk cushion beneath him, its crimson hue a warning of danger, yet only underscoring his vulnerability. When Henry had to sign a decree, he picked up the quill with a trembling hand, as though holding a powerless wand. Ink rippled across the parchment, a few drops landing near the blade of his ceremonial sword, a stain of decay on his authority. In his mind, the spreading ink felt like blood soaking the page, erasing the lofty intentions once penned in his name. Every audience, Henry was wheeled through a makeshift corridor draped in heavy curtains to hide the truth. Thick carpets and tapestries depicting glorious battles became screens that smothered reality. And Henry, seated amid flickering candles, felt a terrible fear. This grand performance would collapse the moment someone discovered his hidden torment. In his rare idle moments, Henry gazed into the overgrown inner courtyard of Hampton Court, where tangled hedges seemed poised to devour the palace itself. The trees lining the walls whispered with the wind, their rustling leaves like an invisible army's march. He felt that sound as death's footsteps, pressing in on him and choking his breath. At such times, Henry imagined himself a chrysalis trapped in a velvet cocoon. Every movement, every attempt to break free met with wooden walls and marble floors. He brushed away a tear, forcing himself silent. Yet in his heart the whisper persisted, "You cannot escape." Despair spread like the seeping pus each time his dressings were changed. As the candles in the great hall guttered to nothing, only dense darkness remained. Henry was carried back to his chamber, the four chamberlains again hoisting him on the pulleys. The jolt as the ropes tightened sent a shudder through his shoulders and spine. They draped him in silken blankets with gentle care, as if laying a dignified mask over his suffering. Yet on his flesh, the agony still pulsed, desperate to rise and scream in the silent night. At last, Henry lay still as a statue of flesh. He listened to his own breathing, slow and laboured like a funeral drum. The precious fragrance dabbed on a bedside cotton ball could not mask the rot that tainted every exhalation. Henry closed his eyes, his heart bleeding, knowing the charade of power would be repeated day after day. Behind the golden drape, he remained curled in nameless pain, fighting in a private world that only he could feel. In 1544, as the ulcer on his leg continued to fester, with pus and unrelenting fevers battered his body, Henry VIII's mind began to slip into the abyss of madness. The palace, once lavishly adorned with glowing candles and rich tapestries, became the stage for unseen soliloquies. Every silent hall echoed with hollow footsteps, as if his own knowledge and power were crumbling away with each hollow sound. One morning, Henry strode into the Privy Council chamber with a stately exterior, Yet whispers filled his head, the voices of the departed. He froze mid-step, his red hair matted to his sweat-drenched brow, his empty eyes fixed on the vacant chair opposite. "Father, I need your counsel," Henry cried, his voice low and mournful, as if directly addressing Henry VII. Almost immediately, his countenance darkened. "Not now," he murmured, as though he heard his father protesting another power grab. Gone were the polished rituals. Henry absently set down his quill, leaving a draft proclamation half-finished. Courtiers exchanged bewildered glances, none daring to interrupt. Just beyond view, the figure of Elizabeth of York, his mother, seemed to appear in the window's muted light. In Henry's mind, he heard her words, "You are broken, my child." He spun on his heel, hissed, "Begone!" and tore the parchment in two, flinging the fragments across the cold stone floor like wounded butterflies. The French ambassador present that day was stunned. He later recounted that Henry bellowed at the empty chair, gripping the table's edge, his voice ringing, "Anne Boleyn, you mocked me in hell. I beheaded you once, and I will do it again." His roar thundered through the hall, silencing the court in fear. Then, in a startling reversal, Henry sighed, sank onto the throne, lifted a goblet of wine, and drank deeply as if nothing had happened, his face eerily serene. In the shadowed room, Henry felt panic surge. He thought of the traitors, each one: Thomas Cromwell, Anne Boleyn, even Thomas More, their ghosts still haunting his mind. He heard the lament of lives taken. "I have slain you. I shall slay again," Henry spoke to himself, as if cruelty were the only means to sustain his power. In that moment, the chamber felt cramped, the stone walls pressing him into a dark corner, compelling him to vow further purges. Not content with invisible conversations, Henry descended into delirium, envisioning himself standing amidst a ruined throne room. The columns were chipped. The ulcer on his leg became a crack across the floor, pus pooling into dark patches everywhere. The wind howling outside rattled the shutters like the mocking laughter of enemies. Henry raised an imaginary shield to deflect non-existent arrows, then struck the wall with his sword clang. Clang the sound, a grim prelude to the massacres he imagined ahead. Even in his madness, Henry occasionally sank into utter despair. He would sit quietly before his ebony writing desk, gazing into the ornate mirror. The reflection of the majestic monarch had vanished, replaced by a weary figure with hollow, sunken eyes. Henry whispered, "I no longer recognize myself." His hushed words reverberated in the empty room, seeping into the dust on the tabletop. On a moonless night, Henry awoke in the biting cold, his fevered body shaking with each labored breath. He crept to the window and gazed into the leaden sky, seeing the crescent moon as a wound in the heavens. "Father, Mother, save me!" Henry implored the darkness, believing his ancestors might materialize to rescue him, but only the wind hissed through the curtains, answered by the ragged beating of his own chest. The next morning, Henry entered the throne room, hair dishevelled, jet stumbling. Courtiers stood at attention, their eyes filled with a mix of reverence and fear. Henry lifted his chin and commanded, "Proceed with the session," yet in his heart, the phrase, "not now," lingered, like a sharp pin driving into the memory of his ghostly dialogues. Henry's mania plunged the court into a murky fog. Each banquet, each stately procession, echoed with hollow laughter, masking his inner groans. Audiences became multifaceted performances, where Henry could interrupt at any moment to address his unseen interlocutors. One council member later recalled, he spoke to the air, then suddenly demanded, "Who opened the window? Who let in the cold wind?" Henry's mind had become an inescapable labyrinth. At times he felt perched at the height of glory, issuing thunderous commands, only to plummet into panic's abyss in the next breath. Madness and paranoia clung to him like twin spectres, never released. And in the rare moments when Henry was lucid, he gripped the arms of his throne to remind himself, "I once led a kingdom. I cannot let this madness consume me." But that hollow reassurance swiftly faded, replaced by the echo, "I am the master of darkness." And the palace continued its routines. Candles still flickered. Court music still played in hidden chambers. But within the king's innermost depths, Henry VIII, the monarch who once ruled England, had become a slave to his own mind, forever battling the ghosts of his past and the delusions of his future, trapped in an unending nightmare. As the year 1547 struck its opening chords, Henry VIII embarked on the final stretch of his life, his body eroded by the very wound that had afflicted him. By January, according to Dr. Wendy's records, the ulcer on his leg had eaten down to the bone, the tissue blackened like charcoal, exuding a bitter, fetid stench, the smell of death. As he described it, every breath Henry drew at that moment seemed to carry the echo of mortality, reverberating through the frigid chamber. The palace, once draped in opulent splendor, now revealed its cracks, walls hung with once vibrant tapestries now damp and musty, windows left ajar to ward off the stench, and icy east winds rushing in to prick the flesh like needles. Servants stood watch all winter, hastily pulling heavy drapes to block the drafts, yet unable to keep the odor from seeping through every crevice, forcing them to clamp handkerchiefs over their noses. His kidney failure became tragically evident. Henry's urine turned a murky, dark brown. Each call of nature was a sorrowful melody, the chug of liquid into a silver chamber pot echoing beside his bed. His abdomen ballooned like a taut sphere. His skin stretched and yellowed, compressing his organs as though he were trapped in a shrinking cocoon. He sat alone, gripping the arms of his seat, every inch of flesh feeling as if it would burst under the mounting pressure. The 20th of January, marked a horrifying watershed. His kidneys ceased, purified filtration. His lungs filled with fluid until each labored breath hissed like a monster roaring in his chest. And his liver poisoned him so thoroughly that his skin took on a jaundiced pallor, his eyes cloudy and dim like an ashen sky. Henry felt his features drained of vitality. The once piercing gaze now drifted like two dull, dark stones. He struggled for air, each inhale a soul-wrenching tug through a narrow slit, each exhale a stark punctuation to life. His cloudy brown eyes flickered with weary hopelessness. When he tried to speak, his voice choked out in halting fragments, "Wah, ter, earn," forcing attendants to shake their heads and stammer as they attempted to interpret his disjointed words. In rare lucid moments, Henry gazed around his royal infirmary chamber funeral silk, draped over his bed. A silver bath basin spotted with rust, ancient cupping instruments gathering dust. He imagined the steady drip of pus as unceasing night rain, the east wind moaning through corridors like death's whispered call, sending his mind into panic. Whenever his fever spiked, Henry would sweat as if submerged, his hair plastered with antiseptic's tang. He felt his skin burn, then abruptly chill, shivering like a gnarled tree root convulsing in the frost. In his mind, each heartbeat sounded like a funeral drum, composing the final symphony of his existence. His distended belly made movement agony. Henry could not shift without hearing a groan erupt from his core. Candlelight flickered against enclosing walls that pressed in on him, as if forcing him into the constricting capsule of his own suffering. Royal physicians pressed stethoscopes to his chest. Each breath's rattle through the bell, a plaintive lament, too advanced, beyond cure. Henry gazed at them vacantly, lips tightening before forcing out a feeble, "Save me," only to be met by the weary creak of his bedside cart's wheel. No miracle forthcoming. When he mustered the strength to lift his head, his eyes fell upon a small mirror on the dressing table. He saw himself hollowed out, sunken eyes aching with exhaustion, cheeks gaunt and lips ashen. The majestic emperor's reflection faded, replaced by a broken man, crushed under disease's weight. Henry felt terror swell as his heart clenched as though about to wrench free of his ribs. In the moments before consciousness slipped away, Henry clutched his funeral silk shroud. Struggling to prolong each breath, he pictured the pus spreading through the palace, as if his pain were tunneling through every wall, shredding the curtains of glory. The steady drip, for the clatter of the chamber pot below the bed, they merged into the last requiem of the mortal realm. In his final instance, Henry felt a rift between body and spirit, two entities that should have united eternally now sundered. He pleaded inwardly, "Do not let me descend into oblivion." Yet only the flicker of candle flames and the swallowing darkness answered, snuffing out all hope. Then, at last, as his breathing shifted into a faint, final moan, Henry fell silent. No more wheezing, no more groans. Only a vast stillness enveloped him. In that hushed instant, he understood that the ulcer had triumphed, carrying him into eternity and leaving an empty throne amid a frozen palace. And when Henry VIII's final shadow was extinguished, the ulcer remained as a grim reminder. Power cannot conquer death. The torments of body and spirit are the cruelest games of all. Shortly after midnight on the 27th of January, the palace, normally hushed, was suddenly filled with a clamorous upheaval. Henry VIII had been summoned to his sickbed to receive Archbishop Thomas Cranmer for his final rites. Candlelight on the altar flickered fiercely, casting dancing shadows across the cold stone walls. The royal chamber felt more confined than ever, as a bitter wind howled through the narrow window, producing a moan, like the lament of a soul about to depart. The moment Cranmer laid his hand on the king's shoulder, Henry jolted violently, his body convulsing, his mouth agape with a mournful groan. 6 attendants rushed forward, each seizing a limb to prevent him from injuring himself. The wooden bed frame, reinforced with steel supports, creaked and snapped with every struggle, as though the very beams were screaming in agony. Mit convulsion. Henry threw back his head and vomited thick, tar-black bile onto his opulent robe. The acrid stench mingled with the rot of his ulcer, forced onlookers to cover their mouths in horror. The metallic wretch echoed through the solemn chamber, shattering the decorum into a chaotic void where disease tore the room away from any semblance of royal dignity. Moments later, Henry sobbed out the names of lost loved ones. "Anne, Mary," he whispered hoarsely. Those ragged syllables, a plea to his former wife and his deceased daughter, hung in the air. He tilted his head back to the ceiling, tears glistening in his eyes, reflecting a loneliness so profound that, though he had ruled a kingdom, he now staggered, heartbroken by loss and pain. Before he could finish calling them, Henry suddenly bellowed, "Fire! Fire everywhere!" His cry rang out like roaring flames, ripping through the half-drawn mourning curtains. He threw back his cloak and pointed into the empty space before him, sobbing, "I see the flames consuming everything." All who stood around, even Cranmer, recoiled, struck by the palpable terror on his ashen face, as if a single lightning bolt might truly set the world ablaze. Zeitsura followed, Zeitsura. Henry doubled over, fingers clawing at the bedrail as his entire body arched in pain. A rattling cough escaped his throat, signaling fluid, overwhelming his lungs. Each labored breath was a screech like a monster's cry, filling everyone with horror. Cranmer bent low, murmuring prayers, clutching his rosary beads, eyes wide with alarm as he watched the king writhe. Shortly before 2 a.m, Henry's eyes suddenly opened. Candlelight danced across his cloudy gaze, his heart racing as beads of hot sweat beaded on his brow. He heard the echo of prayer in his ears, as if two voices whispered at once, one offering comfort, the other luring him toward the abyss. Henry looked up at Cranmer and gripped his hand feebly. Is there a God?" he croaked, each word seeming to drain his remaining breath. In that instant, Cranmer bent closer, his voice deep and steady. "Your Majesty, if your heart still believes, squeeze my hand once more." Henry's eyes widened as he saw in the Archbishop's aged, compassionate face the faint promise of one last glimmer of hope. He strained forward, clutching Cranmer's hand weakly, one final storm of will to cling to a shred of faith. At approximately 2:07 a.m., Henry VIII exhaled a long, final sigh like a death knell. His hand tightened, then slackened, drifting into the stale air. Cranmer felt the warmth leak from the king's palm. His own heart stilled in that sacred moment. The steel-reinforced bed creaked one last time as the 6 attendants released their grip, none daring to speak. The altar candle guttered out, and only moonlight spilling through the window slit illuminated the moment of Henry VIII's passing. In the silent chamber, only the slow, measured breaths of the living remained. Cranmer's gentle exhalation, the stifled sob of an attendant, the atmosphere thick with mourning and fear at the farewell of a king. Thomas Cranmer later recorded the scene in his journal with stunned reverence. His Majesty drew his final breath amid convulsions, having entrusted his soul to God. The sight shook the very earth. The prayers that had filled the hall were replaced by solemn silence. And in that solemn stillness, Henry VIII, the once formidable ruler of Europe, completed his harrowing journey of body and soul within the ancient walls of his palace. When the third day's gong of 1547 reverberated through the winding corridors of Whitehall Palace, Henry VIII lay in eternal rest, but his corpse was not granted a peaceful repose. Less than a few hours after his final breath, the ghastly work of decomposition began in earnest. Still, warm flesh oozed pus, and fetid gases swelled within his chest like an invisible storm, causing his body to inflate rapidly. His lead coffin, sealed tightly within the locked chamber, emitted unmistakable thump, thump sounds as taut skin and tissue stretched and hissed like the tires of a bursting balloon, as though the king's body itself fought to breathe, to resist its final fate. Under Edward Seymour's leadership, the Privy Council immediately issued a strict silence order. No whisper of this horrifying decay was to leave the palace. 3 days of oppressive quiet ensued. Each footstep in Hampton Court sounded as though treading on a tomb. The courtiers' spirits grew heavy. They eyed every heap of salt scattered around, every bolt of resin-coated cloth standing ready, their faces as stony and sealed as the iron doors behind which the dreadful secret lay. The embalming process commenced with urgent intensity. Nearly 45 kilos of coarse salt, a quantity sufficient to preserve an entire ship, were hauled from the apothecary, and massive sacks, bulging with Eastern herbs, were crowded into a hastily erected tent in the corridor. Nutmeg, cinnamon, black pepper, bay leaves. Each pungent spice seemed to mock the putrid stench of the corpse. When the coffin's lid was pried open, a ghostly white mist rose, carrying the heat from the rotting fluids, halting every observer's breath in mid-air. The king's body was laid upon a long wooden table. Attendants, gloved in coarse leather, trembled as they sprinkled handfuls of salt into every cavity across the chest, around the hips, along both thighs, targeting the areas most ravaged by pus. They gazed upon the dark-stained flesh with the awe of men touching the remains of a sovereign once wielding absolute power. From within, the corpse emitted a wet, shuffling sound, the salt and fluids mingling in a ghastly symphony never before heard. Next came the herbs, pressed into every crevice, under the neck, beneath the arms, around each joint. Once graceful articulations now turned bulwarks against decay. Each fragrant bundle served as a talisman to restrain death's advance. striving to bind the king's last breath to his flesh. The atmosphere grew stifling. The potent herbal aroma masked the rot yet amplified the unease, as if pain's greatest relief still carried the promise of torment. Afterward, thick layers of resin-coated cloth were wrapped around the body, each swath encasing him like a final suit of armor. The crackle of the waxed linen and the sharp sting of pine resin overpowered even the herbal scents, proclaiming that no mortal scheme could plunder the Tudor king's power from the silent shell. As the reinforced lead coffin was assembled, iron braces were clinched. Silvered lead straps tightened each metal clasp, drawing sound into darkness, ensuring the outside world would not hear the sovereign's final, muffled pleas. As the artisans secured the last panels, the chamber's candlelight dwindled to a single, struggling wick. Wisps of smoke curled from narrow seams, as though Henry's soul strained against the metal bonds. Before stunned witnesses, the coffin's sides billowed outward like a colossal, beating heart, then collapsed inward with a spiteful sigh, as if the last demon had been confined within that leaden cage. In the hush that followed, Edward Seymour gave the command, "Seal it." The lid slid shut with a muted thump, a solemn decree closing the reign of a dynasty. The courtiers recoiled, chilled as though touching the very brink of death. The air bore a weight as though poised to collapse at any moment under the burden of the secret now entombed. Outside, the winter wind swept at the drapes, stirring them like dark spectres beckoning from the void. The image of that leaden, womb-like coffin swelling and then collapsing stood as testament to a king undone by his own flesh. In the minds of the lords, Henry VIII's corpse was more than an empty shell. It carried the faint echo of a lost soul, the whispered terror of vanished power. Bowing his head, Edward Seymour quietly plotted his next move, to transport the coffin to Windsor at once, avoiding any risk that this chilling truth might leak out. In his distracted thoughts, he realized, power can endure, but before death, even a king cannot escape the cruelest game of fate. And in that moment of sealing the coffin, Henry VIII's body became the coldest symbol of corporeal ruin, a final proof of the inevitable battle between power and oblivion. When the memorial service began in the Great Hall at Whitehall, the atmosphere was anything but the solemn reverence one might expect. Instead, it was a scene of such profound sorrow, it felt as though no one could draw a full breath. Henry VIII's lead coffin, weighing nearly half a ton, was placed on a stand of dark ebony, immediately emitting creak, thump sounds each time a draft swept through the vaulted doorway. Those noises echoed among the silver-grey stone columns shrouded in candle smoke, conjuring the image of the king's body still writhing beneath its heavy metal shell. Unable to find any dignity in death, the stench of decomposition, a vile blend of sour, fetid, and mouldy odors wafted in waves through hair and clothing, forcing every attendee to steel themselves against gasping or an involuntary cry. Attendants hastily layered the coffin in as many black drapes as could be mustered, striving to disguise the shame that even they could not escape with their senses. Yet no number of thick coverings could contain the stomach-churning odor that permeated the entire hall. Fresh flowers, pale lavender asters and white lilies were arranged in wreaths on the walls in an attempt to mask the stench. But their delicate fragrance proved as ineffectual as a thin mist before a torrential downpour of decay. Flickering candlelight wavered like a faltering heartbeat, casting fleeting highlights on the carved wooden frames and creating spectral patches of light amid the pervasive gloom. When the service concluded, the funeral procession set off slowly toward Windsor Castle, along the muddy roads of late winter London. 8 majestic war-horses accustomed to bearing 100-pound barding dragged their hooves listlessly under the burden of the nearly half-ton lead coffin. Each hesitant hoofbeat, followed by a wet slurp through the mire, composed a mournful refrain. Splattered mud clung to carriage wheels and escort mantles, compelling the party to repeatedly brush the thick black sludge from their faces as they progressed. Before setting out, the nobles had been strictly charged not to betray even the slightest grimace. Yet everyone felt the unrelenting tension. They stared at the coffin, as if beholding an unspeakable secret, dreading the chill of the metal against their skins. A biting northwest wind swept through their cloaks, reminding them that all was balanced on the edge of a tragedy, though the procession moved at a snail's pace. Their fear and obsession travelled with the swiftness of the wind, scattering every brittle leaf that lined the way. By the second night, the cortege halted at Can Abbey, a priory Henry had once dissolved. The once hushed convent now exuded an uncanny aura. Candlelight flickered in the chapel, casting the rough pillars' shadows across stone walls, evoking the sense that ghosts of the past still drifted through its corridors. The coffin was carried to the centre of the chapel and placed on an ancient wooden frame, surrounded by dark stained glass that barred moonlight from chilling the corpse further. The steady shuffle of the escort's footsteps sounded like the palace's own laboured heartbeat, a heart that no longer beat, but still echoed with each step. As night deepened, the familiar thump, thump, creak resumed, rendering the abbey's gloom even more oppressive. The rancid stench clung not only to the coffin, but seemed to seep into the massive stones and moss-grown walls, as though the king's remains had imprinted their deathly signature on the very foundation of the priory that once served 80,000 monks. Occasionally, in the dead of night, the soft clatter of wheels along the cloister's walkway would rise, stirring the fear that countless others had been borne away in the same manner, that unspeakable horrors lay buried beneath the priory's ancient soil. The attendants around the coffin, their gaunt faces and weary eyes, forced themselves to keep their heads high, closing their eyes when the urge to sneeze surged from the stench, clad in leather gloves. They spoke only in hushed tones, careful not to let any noise escape beyond their own breaths. In that moment, the procession's purpose was not to escort a soul to rest, but to preserve what little honour remained, to inter both body and shame behind the glimmering veneer of a fading dynasty. The night at Can Abbey passed in near silence, broken only by the wind sighing through the vaulted roof and the occasional soft thump from the coffin. The minds of the living quivered. They felt themselves straddling the boundaries of life and death, caught between inner pride and outward disgrace. They wondered whether this sorrowful secret would fade into the annals of history, or forever haunt posterity like a curse left by a departed king. When spring began to coax new green shoots through the priory grounds, the procession readied itself to continue toward Windsor. The lead coffin was swathed once more in fresh black drapery as dawn's pale light crept across the fields. The scent of herbs and the new cloth could not disguise the fetor that had soaked into every inch of wood and stone. Damp remnants of moss and lichen carried the imprint of that night at Can Abbey as an indelible reminder. King Henry VIII's death and suffering would become a terrifying legend of the Tudor era. Thus, the final journey of the Tudor king's corpse pressed onward, not merely a geographic relocation, but a passage through the deepest layers of the human psyche, where power and death intersect, and where pride and fear merge into a tragic dance never witnessed before. That morning at Can Abbey, the pale rays of dawn filtered through the dark stained-glass windows, yet could not dispel the bone-hilling cold or the pervasive stench of decay. The Privy Council and royal bearers stood in a circle around the lead coffin, draping it in thick layers of black cloth, their nerves taut with suspense. Suddenly, a dry crack like thunder boomed through the misty air, causing everyone to recoil in alarm. The coffin bulged outward as the lead expanded until it fractured, long jagged fissures racing across its surface like cracks in melting ice. Immediately after the explosion, a horrendous foulness burst forth, rancid as a poisonous vapour. Black pus gushed onto the stone floor, spreading like an oil slick on water. Dawn's light glinted on each droplet, turning them into grim jewels, floating in a sea of corruption. The onlookers staggered back in stunned silence, staring at the dripping ooze, as if the king's very soul were melting away into that abhorrent liquid. The once a chill floor radiated warmth, soaked through with pus, reflecting the image of the disintegrating coffin like a shattered mirror. The abbey's stray dogs, creatures, ordinarily skulking for scraps, surged forward and lapped up every filthy drip. The sight of those hounds licking the king's rotting flesh formed a tableau both revolting and pitiable. A final indignity for a monarch reduced to prey. The clattering of their tongues and the wet slur of their licks sounded like the earth itself groaning. Power is but a corpse, inevitably devoured by its kind. End. Royal workers hastily pulled makeshift masks across their faces, sweat beading on their brows. Silently, they scattered quicklime across the floor and piled sand atop the worst of the pools, as though lime and sand could absorb the horror and bury its dreadful secret. The acrid tang of lime fused with the stench of rot, stinging noses so sharply that everyone held their breath. Mouths parched, heads bowed. They worked with tremulous precision, each footfall, each exhalation, a testament to their fear. Fear that the secret would leak. Fear that the court's shame would be laid bare before the world. Outside the cordon, courtiers leaned against the rail, eyes haunted by the sight of the cracked coffin. In their minds, that shattering sound rang out not just upon the black drapery, but within their own hearts. The collapse of glory, the shattering of faith in absolute power. Black stains spread across the funeral cloth, each blot a mark of a tragedy that could never be cleansed. When the coffin was hastily mended, artisans applied steel patches to the fissures. Smoke curled up as metal met flame, mingling with the dawn's mist to give the abbey a ghostly haze. A worker pressed a metal plate into the crack. The hammers clink-clank, echoing like a drumbeat in the chests of the onlookers. The arching branches outside cast quivering shadows on the slick stone, as if recoiling from the Tudor king's ultimate desecration. Finally, the lead lid was screwed back in place, the thick black cloth rewrapped, and lime and sand spread once more across the floor. A royal emissary intoned, "Seal it," the word falling coldly like the final stroke of fate's seal. Everyone stepped back, silent before the leaden sarcophagus guarded now as a dark treasure. They carried a chill down their spines, sensing something had been freed from the coffin with that last thump, only to vanish into the darkness. The abbey returned to an eerie quiet. Only the wind sighed through the cloister's trees. The rustle of leaves, the sole disturbance. The faint lime scent lingered, but could not erase the rot that had soaked into every inch of wood and stone. The hurried footprints of workers on the worn flagstones traced the path of a hidden truth, from the pomp of a royal funeral to the horror of a corpse's final, explosive collapse. In the minds of all present, that moment when the lead coffin split remains indelibly etched. Power is merely a flimsy veil over the decay of flesh. They wondered how long this secret would fade into history, or whether it would endure as a haunting curse. A reminder that even the mightiest king cannot conquer death, and the inexorable law of corruption. As the afternoon light dimmed, the servants quickly gathered their tools. The sodden burial cloths were rolled into heavy sacks, destined for Whitehall. Beyond the abbey walls, cloaked figures drifted away like ghosts, carrying with them the darkest secret of the Tudor court. And amid Cannaby's silence, the final whisper rang out. All glory must fade into nothingness. In each mind, the moment the lead coffin burst open stood as the cruelest proof. Power is fragile before rotting flesh, and the black gases of decay and Henry VIII's suffering would haunt long beyond the annals of history. When the lead coffin draped in black cloth was finally lifted from the straw cart, the east gate of Windsor Castle swung shut in the howling east wind. The pale afternoon light filtered through stained glass windows onto the ancient stone, gilding it with a faint, fading glow as if a veil were drawn over a horrifying secret. Inside the once sumptuous castle, the air turned frigid. Each footstep on the stone floor echoed like a drumbeat across a desolate sea. Everything moved in a frantic rush, hearts pounding, yet the atmosphere felt oppressively heavy. The funeral was so hurriedly arranged that only a few tattered black drapes remained. St. George's Chapel, formerly alive with music and prayer, lay unusually silent, save for the faint rustle of wind on the porch. A handful of candles lined the aisle, their light flickering like torches smothered by the night mist. Scattered flower wreaths, wilted yellow daisies and crushed roses spoke to the ceremony's haste. They had scarcely blossomed before being hastily gathered, carrying an unspoken sorrow. Edward Seymour stood vigil at the entrance to the crypt, his gaze sweeping the scene. Inside him, fear and panic gnawed at pride in his power. He quietly ordered a total information blackout. Any mention of the king's horrific death or ghastly decomposition would be treason. Beneath the protector's sharp stare, not a single courtier dared speak. Each hushed intonation during the rites served as a grim reminder that the truth must be buried beneath folded cloth and the insatiable hunger for authority. As the coffin was lowered into the crypt, the dry thud of earth against lead reverberated through the vaulted ceiling like a collective sigh of the dynasty. The gravedigger's hands trembled with sweat as he scattered the final handful of soil atop the coffin. Candlelight flickered once more, casting elongated shadows across the stonework and transforming the labourer into a spectral silhouette. In that moment, all present felt the solemn ceremony was a mere facade. Beneath lay a secret bomb, ready to detonate if exposed to the light. Official chronicles would later record only this: King Henry VIII died peacefully in his sleep on the 28th of January, 1547. His funeral was conducted with full solemnity at Windsor. There was not a word of his final convulsions, no mention of his festering ulcer, no echo of the coffin's thump, creak. The terse account listed dates and guest names, quietly erasing the horror that had once echoed through those halls. Time marched on, and Windsor settled back into its regular rhythms. The sentries changed watch on schedule. The chapel bells awakened the clergy each dawn. Yet somewhere within that cold crypt, the tattered shroud and stained funeral cloth lingered as silent reminders. The secret of that gruesome death would never truly rest. Private diaries locked away in chests occasionally revealed a few trembling lines. The stench, the torn cloth, such dread, fragments of terror that no passage of years could erase. Foreign dispatches, buried in secret archives, recorded envoys' shock at the funeral's grim scene. The king's majesty had become a spectacle of such suffering that none wished to recall it. But the Tudor court, desperate to preserve its dignity, quashed all rumours under the guise of protecting public order, weaving a legend of Henry VIII passing away tranquilly and transforming tragedy into a refined myth for the privileged few. Over the centuries, the spectre of this story persisted in foreign annals and oral tradition. It was said that on nights around the 14th of February, the spirit of Henry VIII would sometimes wail along Windsor's corridors, tormented by pain within the lead tomb. Visitors claim to hear the flicker of phantom candles at midnight and sense whiffs of lime and herbs, the lingering trace of that clandestine embalming. Thus, from the horrifying secret at Can Abbey to the rushed rites at Windsor, the tale became a lasting terror in Tudor history. Amid the dynasty's splendour, Henry VIII's macabre end stands as the cruelest reminder. No matter how vast an empire one may reign over, none can withstand the corrosive reign of decay or the invisible pull of oblivion. And now, dear friends, the story of Henry VIII's final days and its dreadful secret draws to a close. I hope this tale has carried you on a psychological journey, steeped in rot and solitary power. Now, surrender to a gentle sleep, and dream of once grand palaces turned to ruins in the night. If you found this story intriguing, please click subscribe so you won't miss more chilling historical mysteries. Good night, and I'll see you in the next video.